Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for turning out on this very cold and dreary May day. I'm Susan Burns, Professor of Japanese History here at UChicago and also Director of the Center for East Asian Studies. This talk is part of the East Asia Lecture Series, which the Center co-sponsors with the University of Chicago Library. The series was established in 2016 and provides students, faculty, and members of the community an opportunity to interact with academics who are at the forefront of Chinese, Japanese, and Korean studies here in the US and abroad. The Center for East Asian Studies faculty members nominate speakers with the aim of allowing our community to hear about new and exciting research in their fields. This year marks 50 years since the US government returned the prefecture of Okinawa to Japanese control. Okinawa had been occupied by the US military since Japan's defeat in 1945. To mark the anniversary of the reversion, as it's known, the Center for East Asian Studies has been sponsoring a series of talks this year. Tonight's talk by Professor Gerald Fiegel of Vanderbilt University is part of this series. And on Thursday, we will have another talk on Okinawa. Professor Wendy Matsumura of UC San Diego will be speaking on neocolonialism and the struggle in Okinawa from wartime mobilization to reversion. Professor Matsumura's talk will also be an in-person event held in this room at 5 p.m. and you can register by going to our website, cease@uchicago.edu. Next, I'll turn things over to Professor Michael Bordache, who will introduce Professor Fiegel. But I'd like to say that Gerald and I actually started graduate school here in this very same year, like more than 35 years ago. So it's just a real delight for me to have him back on campus. Professor Bordache is the Robert S. Ingersoll Professor of East Asian Languages and Civilization and works on modern Japanese literature, culture, and intellectual history, as well as on popular music, literary and critical theory, and he's just published a new monograph, I think just a couple months ago, called A Fictional Commons, Natsume Soseki, and the Properties of Modern Literature, and that was published by Duke University Press. So, Michael.
Well, it's a real pleasure to welcome our speaker, Gerald Fiegel, to campus. He is a professor of history and of Asian studies at Vanderbilt University. He previously taught at Lewis and Clark College and at the University of Delaware. As Susan Burns already mentioned, he received his PhD right here on this campus in 1992. And we were talking before the just before we began today, and I had to confess, I'd always thought he was a literature professor. From his books and his works, there's this literary sensibility, and I learned to my surprise he's really a history professor today, a specialist in Japanese history and culture, but he told me that he'd always kind of thought of himself as a literature person, which is great because I'm a literature professor who's always like pretended to be a historian. So we're going to get along really, really well here today. I first encountered Professor Fiegel's works in his 1999 book, Civilizations and Monsters, Spirits of Modernity in Meiji Japan, which is a wonderful book that I highly recommend if you're not already familiar with it. It's a study of how the categories of the monstrous and the fantastic and the supernatural were reorganized as part of modernity in Japan. Not simply how they were excluded from modernity, but how they became part of what we call modernity in Japan. And there are in-depth looks at people like the folklorist Yanagita Kunio, the philosopher Inoue Ennyo, who shared William James's fascination with the supernatural, and the biologist Minakata Kumagusu with his just remarkable obsession with slime molds, which is just a great section of the book to read if you haven't read it. His second book came out in 2012. It's closer in topic to our theme this evening. The title is Beachheads, War, Peace, and Tourism in Post-War Okinawa. It's a study of how the post-reversion vision of Okinawa as a tropical paradise for tourists was built in sort of a negotiation with Okinawa's history of war and occupation, of poverty and economic exploitation, and of divisive political struggles for autonomy. So how this tropical paradise is built on this history, both which is acknowledged but also remade and erased in the process. And his current book project, I understand, is called Multiple Exposure Photography in Post-War Okinawa, 1945 to 1975, and I think today's talk will be drawn from that. The last thing I can say about Professor Figal is it's clear that his research interests follow his passions, because if you follow him on social media as I do, the first thing you learn about him is this wonderful and deep interest in the history of vintage cameras and vintage photography processes, and he's constantly posting, not constantly, but often posting these experimental and very artistic shots taken with a variety of very old cameras and using a variety of developing techniques to bring them out. And so it's not surprising to learn that he's going to be speaking to us today on the history of photography in Okinawa. So please join me in welcoming back to the University of Chicago, Professor Gerald Figal.
Thank you, Professor Bordache, for that all too generous introduction. You articulated my books better than I can when I'm asked to do so. And thank you to the Center for East Asian Studies and the director, Susan Burns, for this very kind invitation. Also, my gratitude goes out to Connie and Hyojin for all their attentiveness, for all the arrangements, and for the hardy of you who came out on this late in the term, late in the day, in this this beautiful Chicago spring day. So I appreciate that you came out for this, and this is my first talk in 3D since January 2020. So if I'm a little rusty, bear with me. But I really do appreciate this opportunity to share with you this project that Professor Bordache alluded to. I've been working on issues of photography in Okinawa for several years now, but that project got set aside for multiple reasons, only the least of which was the pandemic. And so my idea here today is to give you just a glimpse of that book outline. Hopefully the book will get done at some point. And then a taste of the first part of it, and then to dig into one relatively obscure incident that falls within the first part of the book that I think speaks volumes about the power dynamics between Okinawa and the US and Japan a couple of years before reversion. And really I think speaks to the kinds of relationships among these three, through reversion and post-reversion. Okay. Now, as Professor Bordache pointed out, this book project of mine is tentatively entitled Multiple Exposure Photography in Okinawa, 1945-1975. And the goal of this project is to understand how the business and the practice and the subject of photography, like so many other things in occupied Okinawa, were affected by the U.S. military presence. My guiding question is how and to what extent did U.S. military presence shape photography in post-war Okinawa? And I take a wide view of photographic practice, embracing commercial studio photographers, camera shop owners, lab technicians, industry groups, photo clubs, photo events, and photos of Okinawa by Okinawans, mainland Japanese, and Americans. The book outline, as you can see coming up here, I won't go through the details of this. If you want to talk about this afterwards in Q&A, that's fine. But you can probably glean from some of the the titles of the sections and the chapters. What I'm getting at here, what I put together for you today is kind of an overview of the first part. In other words, from speaking about the interactions in the early part of the occupation between U.S. bases and photography business, and then leading up until reversion. Okay. Now, I think to appreciate those issues and the apprehensions that reversion stirred among locals in the photo business, some background on how that business was conducted and how it developed under occupation is necessary. Much of what I have to say about the photography business actually holds true with other businesses in Okinawa. And indeed, my mini thesis for this talk is that the controversy that broke out in May 1970 over a concessionaire contract to provide camera accessories to U.S. military customers was prescient and illustrative of what happened to many local businesses upon reversion when the floodgates were thrown open for Japanese capital, washing away 20-plus years of toiling to establish and maintain viability, even if it meant cutting deals with the occupiers. Local retailers benefited from the lack of import tariffs on goods bought and sold within occupied Okinawa, meaning lower prices, for example, on Japanese cameras coveted by many a Marine soldier and airman stationed there. Camera retailers also had a quasi-monopoly on brand name gear that could only be sold through a system of local licensed agents. That advantage was set to disappear upon reversion. Okinawan businessmen, while generally supportive of reversion politically, were, economically speaking, rightfully fearful of large mainland companies moving into Okinawa with much more capital and economies of scale. Thus, many lobbied for a post-reversion transition period to shelter them from the immediate economic impact reversion would bring. Also, there would be no transition period, and their fears were largely realized. But even pre-reversion, we can see precursors to this scenario, revealing that American support for the local economy was usually more about politics than economics. Or rather, when it was about economics, it was usually about the buying power of U.S. military personnel rather than the economic health of Okinawa. This is what I argue that the 1970 concessionaire case exposes 2 years in advance of reversion. And what transpired then previews the prevailing power dynamics among Okinawa, the U.S., and Japan that would drive their relationships post-reversion. Now, for our purposes today, I'll simplify this overview background into 2 phases. The first phase would be coincident with the mainland occupation, well, technically the Allied, but the U.S. occupation of Japan from 1945 to 1952. And this period was characterized by kind of do-it-yourself solutions to which really represented a kind of, doing whatever one could with available resources. I mean, it was a time when necessity was the mother of invention. It was as much, the business at that time was as much make-do bricolage as it was normal business. So we'll call this sort of business as bricolage period. Now, the second phase is from the end of the occupation of Japan to the late 1960s. So in other words, through the Korean War fueled base construction boom in the early 1950s in Okinawa, through the Vietnam boom from the mid-60s and late 60s, and in the run-up to the reversion. Now, during this time, the photography business operated through a system of licensed local dealers of Japanese-made gear, concessionaire contracts with military exchanges, independent studios and photo finishing labs, pawn shops, and the black market. Now, this hybrid assemblage was normalized under the abnormal conditions of occupation and became the relatively stable ground that reversion would shake. So we'll call this period as business as unusual. Okay. Now, outside of pawn shops in the black market, this business as unusual was composed of three types of brick and mortars. Photo service labs, aka DPE shops, and DPE is development, processing, enlargement. Photo gear, second, photo gear and camera shops, and third, portrait studios, with or without on-site DPE services. These could be Okinawa-owned or American, foreign-owned or American-owned, but the latter was sure to have local employees as assistants, lab techs, office staff, and often as managers. And there's some crossover among these, but I'm going to simplify things. We're going to focus mostly on the first and second of these, the photo service labs and the photo gear and camera shops, because they had some more direct relationships with the bases and also with reversion-related issues. So let's take a first look at the early post-war situation facing would-be photography businesses, beginning with the recollections of renowned photographer, camera shop owner, and elder statesman of post-war Okinawa photography, Yamada Minoru. He says here, when it came to film, it was usually Kodak, pawned black market stuff from the PX. Canisters of aerial film came flowing from the Koza black market. We'd get it and cut it in the darkroom. We'd eyeball 20 and 36 frame lengths, cut it appropriately, and then sell it. That's because back then, it wasn't yet officially importable. Pawned military PX goods circulated from Koza area pawn shops at cheap prices. These were all Japan-made cameras. Occasionally, there were also American-made cameras. In other words, put it in a pawn shop and it flows to the market. That was the business we stressed, rather than stuff coming directly from the mainland. There were still guys who would walk around carrying stuff to sell. There were a couple few merchants who'd buy pawned gear from the Koza pawnbrokers and go sell it in Naha. That's how it was in the early days of the Okinawa camera business. And I'll point out that the pawn shop circuit that he references here existed throughout this occupation period, and it boomed particularly in the late '60s with the Vietnam War. He tells in another section of this interview, he talks about these Marines and airmen who would take their gear to pawn shops and sell it before heading off to Vietnam, and then dealers would come and scoop them up and put them in the local market. Now, Yamada relates these extremes of the sort of scrappy make-do nature of the photo business during the first several years after the war's end. He also points out these crucial connections that it had with the U.S. military. This direct contact with bases, paired with limited direct contact with the burgeoning photo business and photo culture of the mainland before reversion, gave rise to a particular historical development of the photography business, photographic practices, and photographic content throughout post-war Okinawa. Now, our focus is going to be on the history of that development here, or the business part of that development. And for that, I'm going to jump back just a little bit to the pre-war period. In the wake of the wartime devastation, the material conditions for resuscitating what had been a flourishing photography business in pre-war Okinawa were bleak. The lively concentration of the commercial studios in downtown Naha, mapped out here, was devastated by the American air raid on October 10th, 1944, 6 months before the land invasion. I marked here the Asahi studio, one of the largest and most successful in pre-war Okinawa because of its personnel connections with the revitalization of photo businesses after war's end. And yeah. Now, the Asahi, I have a couple photos of it from 1940. It was a very flourishing studio in the pre-war, New Year's Day, 1940. This is the photo I wanted to get to. This is the staff, 1941, and the owner, Hirooka Minoru, in the center there. This photo, I really like it. It's my desktop on my computer at home, and so these people have been staring at me for many years now at home. But the person who's not in this photo is the one who I really want to bring up, because he represents this direct connection from pre-war photographic knowledge and expertise into the post-war. He might have been taking this photo for all I know, but I couldn't. He's not in this photo, and that would be Nakamoto Ryoei. He was the last chief lab technician at the Asahi Shashinkan until the 1010 air raid. Now, Nakamoto is a really interesting guy. It was in 1930 when he joined the Asahi at the age of 14. And when he was there in his first few years, he worked on picture postcards and school photos. I don't know if he actually did this one. I chose this one because you could imagine that the Asahi Shashinkan is kind of in the center and a little bit to the left. That was the studio area in Naha. And picture postcards was one particular specialty of the Asahi. Now, unfortunately for Nakamoto, he was hit by a dengue fever epidemic that spread through the Ryukyus in later 1930, I believe. And he left work to convalesce, later to be rehired by Asahi's chief lab technician, whose position Nakamoto eventually assumed after 4 years of military service. He retained that position until his studio was destroyed in the 1010 Naha air raid. Now, in an ironic turn, Nakamoto, as an experienced photographer and lab tech, was hired immediately after the war in 1945 by the information section of the US military headquarters. His job was to photograph the war damage Okinawa had suffered. Nakamoto recalls having conflicted feelings, as he put it, carrying around a US military issue speed graphic 4x5 large format camera when the possession and use of cameras by Okinawans were at that time regulated. Once he opened his own studio in January 1948, his connections with the US military assured a steady stream of film and printing paper for him and his colleagues in the commercial photography business. For example, Sonoda Minobu, the owner of the Rose Photo Studio, related, quote, "Mr. Nakamoto took advantage of his military connections and got a hold of fresh film and printing paper, which was a great help to us all." Nakamoto was only one of many Okinawan photographers and technicians hired by the US forces. Azuma Keiyu, the second of 4 generations of studio owners from pre-war to the present, similarly recounted benefiting from his sister's employment in Ryukyu Command's photography division in the late 1940s. Now, access to locally scarce and expensive photographic materials was not the only fringe benefit of having connections with the occupiers. Scores of locals who opened their own photography businesses were first employed and trained in photo studios and processing labs run by Americans to serve the needs of base personnel and their families. In other words, base-related photo service businesses were training grounds for learning studio lighting, camera operation, film development, enlargement printing, and the business aspects of the profession. They also kept Okinawans in touch with the latest photographic technologies. Pictured here is one local, Casey Kiyuna, working in a darkroom, rinsing and examining print enlargements for the US military. Now, the YN photo finishing / RICOM photo service established within Ryukyu Command, that's RICOM, Ryukyu Command, a military exchange system in 1947 by the Filipino PX concessionaire, Priscillo Ibanez, seems to have been the first on-base photo service that employed Okinawans, many of whom became leading figures within the local commercial photography industry during the 1950s. Highlighted here are 2 of the grads from RICOM Photo Service, Sugita Takeshi and Mizushima Genko. I'm going to give you a few of the relevant details on Sugita's place in the early period of this business as bricolage, before moving on to this business as usual. Now, born in Kyoto in 1906 And moving in 1927 to Naha, where he worked for the prefectural government, Sugita was what we might call a naturalized Okinawan. After the war, he joined the photo finishing staff at RICOM Photo Service at the invitation of a friend who had already been working there. He soon opened a portrait studio in 1947 and later became a leading member of the Naha Area Commercial Photographers Association, which was founded in 1956. Here he is seated among, he's in the back row there, he's seated among some other old-timers who gathered in 1977 to discuss this early history of post-war photography business in Okinawa. And I marked the other four who've come up here. It's interesting that Nakamura's old boss, Hiroka, was also at this Zadankai. Not to say that the transcript for this Zadankai, as well as the short history that these men helped put together, have been really crucial source materials for me. Lots of really interesting insights from these guys. Let's see. Oh, okay. Yeah. So Sugita, owning a photo shop in Naha, a studio in Naha, and one of the first ones in the 1940s. He was also one of the first professional photographers in Okinawa to have to submit to RICOM's military directive number 9. This was issued on February 14th, 1949, and enacted on March 1st, 1949. It declared that, quote, all Ryukyuans in Okinawa Gunto in the possession of cameras, equipment for the development or enlargement of photographs, and undeveloped film shall register such possession with the chief of police of the district wherein such possession is exercised. Now, like all such directives, it was translated into Japanese, and both versions distributed to all 50 districts. Owning a studio in Naha, Sugita carried a registration booklet issued by the Naha District Police. Now, page 1 of the booklet bullet points the requirements of the directive. Pages 2 and 3 reveal what photo gear he registered 2 weeks after the directive went into effect. His 3 cameras and lenses were pre-war Japanese and German makes. All of his film, printing paper, and processing chemicals were American, undoubtedly Kodak, probably obtained through base connections. MG Directive Number 9 remained in effect until June 22nd, 1953, just over a year after the end of the U.S. occupation of mainland Japan and a month before the end of the Korean War. Now, my friend, colleague, and fellow Chicago PhD, Alan Christie, hypothesizes that the duration of the directive from the imminent communist victory in China in 1949 to the end of the Korean War, and the fact that it was copied to the U.S. Counterintelligence Corps detachment in Okinawa, whose task was the suppression of communist activity, suggests its intention was to monitor potential makers of images that might feed communist propaganda. Whatever the case, it did pose an inconvenience to local photographers like Sugita trying to maintain photo businesses in the early post-war period. I wish, this is a transcription of his original booklet that was published, and I wish I had more, because you can see when he had to re-register, every time he got something new, he had to put in this little booklet, and turn it into the local police. Now, one last important early photo service that brings us into the next period of the photo business under U.S. occupation was a PX concession simply called Photo Service when it was first established around 1950 by an American civilian architect, Albert Mosher, who was employed in base construction operations headed by the Army Corps of Engineers. Mosher's side business in photo services grew rapidly along with the bases he helped design, expanding in 1954 as the American Photo Service and adding a second PX concession on Kadena Air Base. Dozens of Okinawans were employed by Mosher as studio assistants, lab technicians, office staff, and eventually business managers and company president. By the mid-1950s, after mainland occupation ended, it came to exemplify this business as unusual. In an Okinawa that was cut off from Japan and grafted onto U.S. bases. So let's now move on to what was in place before reversion would threaten it. Now, in December 1956, the American Photo Service again expanded, renewing its concession to operate its portrait studio and securing a significant new concessionaire contract from Raycom Central Exchange to pick up, process, and deliver films daily to all main branch exchanges. A quick look at the details of this agreement will suffice to give you a sense of how base-related business was structured from the mid-1950s to the late 1960s. And he employed at least over 100 locals in the American Photo Service. Now, the first thing to note is that having a local Okinawan president, manager, or joint owner was a common practice with Americans. Mosher still owned the American Photo Service in 1956, but its president and its operations managers were both Okinawan, Kubota Seiko and Tsuha Jitsuo. It was Kubota who signed the initial 3-year agreement with Exchange Officer Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Hamlin. It went into effect on December 1st, 1956. Now, the terms of the agreement included an itemized price list for various film formats within 9 service categories. And I could easily geek out over the technical details of this list, but I'll spare you my obsession. Instead, allow me to highlight a handful of the 18 points of the main agreement that suggest the asymmetrical nature of business as usual. First of all, the contractor, in this case, the American Photo Service, had to absorb the cost of processed film that went unclaimed for 90 days at the branch exchange and returned to the contractor. And this was time lost and literally chemicals down the drain. The contractor agrees to, quote, to indemnify and save harmless and defend the exchange against any claims arising from damage or loss of property, injury, or loss of life in any manner caused or contributed to by the contractor or its agents. And this allowed for a lot of wide interpretation. The contractor could not advertise itself to the public in any way as being a representative of the United States or the exchange, nor, quote, use the words Raycom Central Exchange, Post-Exchange, PX on letterheads, bills, signs, or in any manner connected with pickup process or delivery of films. In other words, the American Photo Service, despite its namesake, could not advertise itself as the official photo services provider for the American military in Okinawa. Prices had to be in accordance to the appended price list, agreed upon by contractor and exchange. Now, this seems like it would present an opportunity for fair negotiation of prices at market rates, but the market was not normal in Okinawa. The exchange always sought below market rates, your discounts at least 10%. Now, the contractor had to give 30 days notice if it wanted to terminate the contract. The exchange had to give only 10 days notice. And finally, upon any termination by either party for whatever reason, the PX had the option and first right to purchase all equipment furnished and used by contractor at a price determined by a disinterested officer appointed by the commanding general at UQ's command. Now, as asymmetrical as concessionaire contracts with Raycom Central Exchange might seem from our present perspective, local photo service businesses considered them plum deals because they guaranteed a steady flow of work from clients who shot a lot of film, required a lot of film processing and photo printing for professional and personal reasons. And they had a lot of money. Steady volume made up for the discounts and kickbacks to the exchange so long as the contractor could keep up with the volume and maintain quality. Now, that could be a tall order if hampered by supply shortages or labor strikes, such as the one that took place on August 1957, when workers at the American Photo Service joined other workers across Okinawa demanding bonuses for the Obon season. Mosher had sold the business to Kubota Morihiro before the strike and returned to the U.S., turning it fully over to Okinawan hands, minus its operations manager, Tsuha, who left because of this labor dispute. The business manager and him eclipsed any sense of solidarity with Okinawan workers. Tsuha opted instead to join ex-Air Force photographer Ernest Gordon Bradford as owner and manager, respectively, of the Keystone Studio and the Keystone Photo Service, which became the most well-known photo businesses serving base personnel and their dependents. Now, during his 18 years in Okinawa, Bradford became a minor celebrity under his preferred nickname, Blackie the Photographer, for the black he dressed in and the cars he drove. An experienced photographer, he used his connections with the military, with overseas photographic suppliers, and with Okinawans to grow his business while producing his own considerable body of photographic work. Now, his role as a businessman and a photographer in Okinawa has received practically no attention among Okinawan and Japanese researchers, and I intend to actually amend this gap and put him into the canon of photography in post-war Okinawa. And it was interesting, I thought this might be a dicey thing to do, and I met with the widow of Tomatsu Shone, a very well-known mainland photographer of Japan, and I asked her point blank, I said, "What, do you know about this photographer, Blackie the Photographer?" He said, "No, tell me." And I showed her some stuff. I said, "Now, do you think it's okay if I include him in a history of post-war Japanese photography?" She said, "Absolutely." So I got the green light from a person who's actually leading a small group of generally young independent researchers to put together a history of photography in Okinawa from the 19th century to the present. Now, Bradford's 18 years of photography work paralleled a proliferation of independent portrait studios from the early 1950s to the late 1960s, numbering well over 100 across Okinawa. Portrait studios arguably became one of the more successful business sectors despite limited access to the mainland photography scene. The do-it-yourself perseverance of the early post-war years bore fruit to create a photography culture with a distinct identity apart from the mainland. Now, the last part of the photo business scene in the run-up to reversion is camera shops. Japanese cameras and related gear, the stuff Americans in Okinawa craved, could not be sold, by mainland manufacturers. They had to go through this local rep system. This brought certain benefits that would expire upon reversion. Now, arguably the best example of this local rep system was the man who ended up at the center of the 1970 contract bidding controversy, and that was Yamada Minoru. And he had 3 different shops. This was the second of his shops, just before reversion. Now, Yamada's stories of being the sole Nikon rep until reversion attest to the multiple ways the U.S. military presence impacted photography in Okinawa. After opening his first shop in 1952, he hustled for customers amid the base building boom. And in addition to drawing Americans to his shop, he talks about toting cameras in a furoshiki on a bike among the camps that were built for the hundreds of Japanese contractors who were hired by the Americans to build Kadena Air Base. Now, it's no surprise that given that the price of a new Japanese camera was about the same as your average salary monthly salary for an Okinawan, it's no surprise that most of his business was U.S. military and the Japanese contractors. Now, the presence of the bases, Yamada notes, actually it helped a lot of the local independent portrait studios because there was a steady stream of Okinawans going into these portrait studios for ID photos to work on base, and also for passport photos. There was this passport system within this U.S.-controlled UQ. So if you wanted to go outside, you had to have a passport. So a lot of this sort of day-to-day business were school photos, IDs for work, passports, and such. Now, the importance of the bases and the occupation regime to Yamada's business and that of fellow Okinawans was underscored with the anticipation of reversion. They knew that direct marketing by mainland manufacturers would begin, and they would not be able, I jumped ahead there, it's okay. And they would not be able to compete with the volume discounting through department stores or with mainland supply and distribution networks. Now, a preview of this problem arose 2 years before reversion, over the bidding and the award of a major concessionaire contract. This case offers an x-ray of the structure of the power and priorities that Okinawans found themselves caught in with little room to maneuver. And so I'd like to go through this in a little bit of detail to wrap up this presentation. So a timeline of the events here. I'm going to go through fairly quickly. Now, on May 16, 1970, the Pacific Exchange Procurement Office, or PASEX, published in Okinawan papers a solicitation for bids for a concessionaire contract to handle camera parts and accessories for the entire Okinawa Regional Exchange. This was a pretty big deal. On June 3rd, 4 Okinawan bidders received rejection letters stating that because all proposals were non-responsive, an award will not be made at this time. A 5th bidder from Japan was disqualified for not being Ryukyuan and lacked capability. Now, this 5th judgment aligned with the USCAR, that's the United States Civil Administration of Ryukyus, or USCAR. This 5th judgment that the bidder was from Japan and not Ryukyuan aligned with USCAR policy to always try to hire qualified Okinawans first. Now, on June 18th, it was announced that the contract was awarded to the Japanese firm Sanroku Shokai and its newly registered on June 15th Okinawan subsidiary. 4 of the rejected bidders accepted the result. 1 cried foul. The disgruntled one was the Okinawa Photographic Supplies and Accessories Traders Association, a collective formed expressly for this bid. It was composed of 7 camera shop owners, including Yamada Minoru, and was headed by the principal initiator of the bid, Toma Shie of Toma Camera Company. Judging that the capital and supply requirements described in the bid announcement was more than any single local vendor could provide, Toma hastily organized a coalition that he thought would meet the requirements and be competitive in the bidding. On May 30th, just 4 days before receiving the rejection, Toma had sent a letter to the presiding PASEX contracting officer, Nellis Hedrick, laying out the rationale for the collective bid and assuring him that the association members were all professionals with many years of experience in the photography business. And he said that they all agreed that they would cooperate and to fulfill the charge of this new concession. Toma pointed out that the group was very concerned because 80% of their business was the U.S. military. And so they figured that if you had an on-base concession, their business would be hit really hard. They would practically lose all of that business. Now, it's doubtful that Hedrick ever seriously considered the group's bid, despite claiming that he did give it due consideration in the very curt letter of rejection that he sent to Toma Camera Company. Now, Toma's group was outraged. When they were outraged because they read 2 weeks later that the contract was awarded to a mainland Japanese firm, directly counter to the U.S. policy to hire Okinawans first if possible. In response, the group decided to call out USCAR on the decision. The petition they sent on June 25th to Robert Fire, signed by Yamada, masks this outrage, but makes very plain the group's sense of existential crisis. It's worth reading key passages to appreciate their understanding of what was happening and their level of panic. In the middle of the letter here, Yamada writes, "It is greatly regrettable that not a chance for negotiations has been given to the local applicants, and the company from Japan suddenly will make inroads into Okinawa. It is said that the concession will handle 800 kinds of items from all manufacturers at a price from 15 to 20% lower than market." And then he continues towards the end of his petition here. "We, the photographic suppliers and accessory traders, have laid out our business foundation after toil for 20 years and now it is about to be fundamentally destroyed because of the advance of one trader from Japan into the military base on Okinawa. Consequently, all local photographic traders are living in anxiety with the problem of not only closing stores by financial failure, but rather a serious problem of life or death of numerous employees and their families. In order to protect our living, we must call to all to request for their cooperation to restrain the advance of Sanroku Shokai into Okinawa. So they know what's going to happen if this goes through. Now, the routing slips show that the civil administrator's office received the petition on July 2nd, but no action was taken until the association's second angle of attack set off a chain of events. The group sent their complaint to the pro-reversion chief executive Yara Chobyo of the GRI, that's the government of the Ryukyu Islands. And this prompted a meeting between Yamada and the GRI on July 6th, where Yamada asked the GRI to intervene to keep the contract from Sanroku Shokai from going into effect. He met with the Government and Legal Affairs Division in the morning. Now, in the afternoon of July 6th, the GRI Trade and Industry Director goes to visit the USCAR Economic Department Director. That's what the EC is. Now, these actions set off by Yamada is finally what prompted USCAR to take the complaint seriously and order a full investigation into the facts surrounding the decision, contrary to its own locals first policy. Now, the EC director is Edgar Hoppe, and he initiates an investigation on July 7th. And to his credit, once he orders this inquiry, he was very thorough, and he took the contracting officer, Annalise Hedrick, to task for his decision, effectively siding with the local dealers until he could be convinced that there was a compelling reason to award the contract to this mainland firm. Now, his attitude appears largely driven by the politics of prepping Okinawa for reversion. The series of memos among USCAR officials, Pacific Exchange, the GRI, and Yamada's group is fascinating in revealing how the politics and economics surrounding reversion shape decisions and heighten tensions of all concerned parties, even in a relatively small local business affair. Now, I have time only to share highlights from these documents, and I'll then summarize some conclusions. But some of the juiciest bits are in the draft edits and the marginalia of these things. These are the best things to look at when the officials crossing out, no, say this. Can you change the language here? You can kind of see their thinking of how they need to present this in official documents. Now, let's start, however, with Chief Executive Yada's memo that he sends to the civil administrator on July 15th. Because I think he articulates very well the stakes that are involved here. And he says, at the time of as the time of reversion is approaching, the government of the Ryukyu Islands is now endeavoring to promote local industries and not to create an economical confusion when the reversion is effected. It is firmly believed that the United States Civil Administration is also making the same efforts. However, to grant a concession to a Japanese businessman at this stage will be a significant influence not only upon 14 importers and about 200 retail dealers, but also upon the Okinawan economy. If concessions for other businesses are granted in the same manner, the economy of Okinawa will certainly be confused. Yada then asks for the contract to be given to locals or to nobody. Now, the next day, on the memo routing slip for the circulation of Yada's memo, among USCAR officers that were tasked with preparing a response to the GRI and with making inquiries of the Pacific Exchange officer, Fury scribbled the $64,000 question here. How do we evaluate PASEC's non-responsive proposals? Reply. Should PASEC be immune to political considerations? There would seem to be significant U.S. interest in utilizing Ryukyuan companies whenever possible until our day, reversion. Now, Fury's second question about immunity from political considerations is another way of asking if Pacific Exchange should always give greater weight to economic and capacity considerations. To Hedrick, the contracting officer, the answer was simple. Of course, PASEC should ignore politics when making economic decisions. But Hoppe, before Hoppe received Hedrick's complete report, however, the politics of the situation were far from being ignored. Hoppe responded directly to Fury's questions in a memo on July 20th. I mean, he said, excuse me, this is not, I'm going to go there yet. He said he didn't see that the local bids were non-responsive. He saw no reason that Pacific Exchange should be immune to political considerations. And he agreed that it was in U.S. interest to hire local, adding that they were bound by an executive order to strive for a viable local economy. But he added that there were opinions from the liaison and legal departments in USCAR. The liaison department opined that all things being equal, it's politically better to award locals. However, at this late date, the legal aspect is paramount. And then legal chimed in and warned that a breach of contract with a successful Japanese bidder would expose Pacific Exchange and the U.S. government to substantial claims for premature contract termination. Legal added that it had been informed by Hedrick that the contract was already awarded, $100,000 of merchandise was already shipped to Okinawa, 6 locals had already been hired by Sandoku Shokai. In other words, USCAR was faced with a fait accompli that would be impossible or very expensive to undo. And Hoppe was not happy about this. He lambasted Hedrick's cursory explanation for his decision that he received on July 23rd, calling it totally inadequate and unresponsive. Hedrick argued that the very existence of the collective, in other words, the group that Yamada was part of, was proof that no individual firm had the capacity to take on this concession, and Pacific Exchange had a policy that they would not accept collective bids, claiming that you never know when the collective would fall apart. Okay. Now, thus, he turned to Sandoku Shokai, which had already proven itself as a reliable concessionaire at Yokota and Tachikawa air bases on mainland Japan. And he did this outside the bidding system and without consulting USCAR, because to him the solution was clear. The mission of the exchange is to, quote, provide the best merchandise at the best price for the military customer. Sandoku Shokai could provide that. Hoppe ordered Hedrick to try again and come back with a more detailed explanation. Now, in the meantime, this was kicked up to the High Commissioner, Lieutenant General Lampert. He's the top commander in USCAR. And Lampert knew full well the politics of reversion that was coming up. In his July 27th letter to Okinawa Regional Exchange Commander, Colonel Cassert, Lampert reminds Cassert of his policy to use local firms whenever possible, as you can read here. I'll let you read that. At the end here, he notes, let's see, there we go. He notes at the end here, any imagined rebuff or bypass will tend to generate unfavorable political climate. Now, at the same time, Lampert knew that this deal could not be undone. And he asked Cassert to explore ways to lessen the negative impact. What Cassert comes up with 3 days later was a plan to increase local procurements of hamburger patties, bacon, jewelry, lacquerware, fishing gear, and Odeon beer. And he was really excited about the Odeon beer. And it's worth noting what he said about selling this excellent draft beer in bottles. He told Lampert, quote, "This could be done on a test basis, certainly before reversion. If anything is going to be done along these lines, it should be done now before the highly competitive Japanese beers cut into the Odeon market." And so beer brewers and camera dealers were in the same boat, bracing for the same tsunami. Now, Hedrick's revised report to Hoppe in mid-August made even clear that the economic considerations of U.S. military personnel always trumped all others and effectively ended the investigation. Hedrick cited the association that the association offered only a 7% concessionaires fee to the exchange instead of the usual 10%. He noted that this was because the group would in some cases have to go through a third-party agent, thus incurring greater fees, because not all of the persons in this collective had direct contact with mainland manufacturers. And of course, this fact was largely the result of U.S. policy to restrict and regulate such contacts. Now, in effect, any Okinawan bid on a contract of this magnitude was doomed from the start. Now, it's reasonable to assume that Hedrick knew this. And so he had a known Japanese firm in his pocket, ready to sign on through a single source commodity concession agreement as soon as Sanroku Shokai had registered an Okinawan subsidiary. This setup would legally bypass the need for the bids and technically be local. Hedrick stressed that about 15 Ryukyuans were now already hired, and 6 technicians from the mainland were brought to train them. The speed with which everything fell into place for Sanroku Shokai is suspect, to say the least. In the end, the crucial determination summed up in the final economic department report to FIRI was that the exchange had no alternative if the best interests of the U.S. government and the Okinawa Regional Exchange customers were to be considered. The bottom line was the bottom line. These economic interests clashed with those of the local dealers and jettisoned the political interests of both the United States and the GRI. While local labor was eagerly exploited, it was often inconvenient and not always most profitable to deal with local business owners, no matter what an executive order and USCAR policy might instruct you to do, or what reversion-related political considerations might require. Action on this petition formally closed on September 4th, with FIRI's 3 weeks belated reply to a follow-up query Yamada had sent him after learning that despite the petition, Sanroku Shokai had concessions already opened on Kadena Air Base and at Fort Buckner. Now, knowing that in those 3 weeks' time the case was decided, one can't help but feel pathos for Yamada's earnest exposition of the facts and astute questions about how the contract was awarded to Sanroku Shokai. He notes the subsidiary's meager capitalization and lack of expertise, and then ticks off the compressed chronology of events, asking, did they ever participate in the bidding? Was the decision made by appointing them? Well, effectively, yes. A familiar, well-connected, well-capitalized Japanese company was appointed because it best served the military customer and the exchange's interests in the volume and at the prices that they demanded. FIRI's reply to Yamada is professional and thorough, responding in detail to each of his questions. Now, the recurring theme throughout his answers, however, is that Yamada was directing his criticism at the wrong entity. The subsidiary's capitalization and staff expertise are irrelevant because, quote, it has the unlimited financial backing of the parent company, the Japanese company. The apparent lack of expertise among the staff, the local staff, is no matter because the parent company was sending Japanese technicians. Now, this case makes clear that it didn't take actual reversion to start feeling its effects. Japanese competition was already in Okinawa by proxy. This episode in 1970 was a trailer for the feature presentation 2 years hence. I just want to wrap it up here with a few takeaways, what to make of all this that I've thrown at you. First of all, I think this is a generalizable story of occupied Okinawa. But there's some significant particularities with the nature of the photo business, and we can maybe talk about that if you want. Reversion was widely, the impact of reversion was widely shared in the business community, but there were some differences how it would impact the photography business. I think the transfer and transformation of pre-war expertise to the post-war is worth noting. Those photo studios and labs were destroyed, but there was a lot of human know-how that did survive the war, and you see it being recreated throughout the post-war period. There's this really creative adaptation of know-how in very challenging conditions. both among these old pros and then a lot of these the younger generation that were learning the profession. And there's what I would call a double-edged codependency. This business as unusual here. It's a codependency because it is rather asymmetrical, but the bases, they could get into issues when trying to deal with locals or hiring locals. They often benefited, but sometimes they could run into some problems. But it was a very much a codependency. The American customers in Okinawa are very used to getting things at a cut rate and having them in good supply. And on the other hand, you have the Okinawan businessmen who want this business, but it's really at the pleasure of the military. And so this is kind of an unequal marriage of convenience, and I think you see it in pre-war and through reversion and in the post-reversion period. And I'm just leaving you here with one of Yamada's photographs on Reversion Day on May 15th. One of the avenues that had parades and people lined up taking photos of the events. I think that's enough for me right now. Yeah, no, I'm happy to take any questions if you want to ask, about things that I couldn't get into, or I'd be more than happy. Yeah.
Two questions that came to mind. One, you very briefly touched on this, but you really have time to expand on it. The period you're looking at, the 1950s and 60s, and gun photography exploded as a hobby in Japan. And you mentioned a different sort of photography culture that developed in Okinawa in this period on a very different economic and social conditions. I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about the different cultures. And then the second question is, one of the things that's really fascinating in the 1970 incident is people looking ahead to reversion and trying to imagine what Okinawa might be or can be after reversion. And clearly, that Yamada and his group have some sort of vision about what Okinawa should be after reversion. That doesn't, obviously doesn't come from me, but if you can spell out a little bit about what do they see as the possibility of reversion? What do they hope is going to happen with reversion? What's the dream of post-1972 Okinawa that they have that's going to be frustrated?
Well, on the first point about, that's actually, your first point is sort of what inspired me to look at this in this way, because, indeed, it's during the 60s and 70s where photography is really taking off. This is when, Japanese camera manufacturers are meeting and besting the German camera manufacturers by the 60s, and then the Nikon F comes out, and that's everybody's go-to. That was the go-to camera for Vietnam, photojournalists there. And so all this is happening, all of the new gear, the new innovations. And I was thinking about this. I said, look, Okinawa's kind of like, as it was missing out on a lot of things on the mainland, they're missing out on what was, a very vibrant, photography culture that was developing, and no pun intended, in the mainland. And so I said, well, so then how's it happening here? And it's, it's in this really kind of twisty, weird way where, they have, limited contact with manufacturers through this licensing system. And then on the other hand, that they're getting some more direct connections with some of the American stuff that the mainlanders aren't getting, okay? And so there's they have a little edge with some of this stuff because the U.S. military, they had some top gear, they had some top labs. They have, pretty much unlimited supplies of all the Kodak material. And it wasn't the case. It was more expensive if it was in Japan. They didn't have much of the Kodak stuff in Japan. So, so that was different. They're using some different materials and different kinds of lab gear and such. And so there's the gear aspect of that, and then there's another. I can't get into too much detail, and it's a little bit different from this question, but it's related. I was interviewing one studio owner. He was the son of a studio founder in 1958, and he said something that I didn't expect. Because I kind of thought I'd hear him talk about how hard and difficult this was during this period. My dad was really slaving away, And he was going on about how, this was like one of the coolest things to be a part of. And Okinawan studio photographers, like portrait studios in particular, they developed all of these kind of new, I almost kind of want to call them the Hallmark holidays, these new days and events to take photos of your family or your kids, like the 100 days after the birth, you take a picture of the kid. And so they actually laid claim to some of these special times and days, times of the year or certain ages where so he was going on and on about this. This was an Okinawan invention, And so I have to look a little bit more into that. I think, well, again, the latter part of the book, I'm going to get into more of like the imaging, what they're taking photos of and such, And that's really, there's a lot written about that. That's why I'm kind of staying away from it. I want to look at it in a different way. And I want to see, how that separation from the mainland creates, different kinds of images, and particularly kinds of images that you wouldn't have, obviously, if there was a military there. And so that's a whole other thing. Now, their vision, I mean, again, this is why I kind of slid from the Okinawa tourism book to this, because I was seeing a little bit of this coming in the tourism book. I was seeing these visions of what was going to happen, and I was seeing parallels of this with the development of photography. I think there were a couple study tours that Okinawan commercial photographers took to the mainland, and they visited, Fuji's sites, their chemical sites, and they are, one thing they're dreaming of is that they'll have access, that they can strike deals with these, and they'll be their deals. Okay, I think that's what the vision is that once after reversion, we can freely go up there. We can cut deals with Nikon, with Olympus, with Fuji, and profit directly. On the other hand, it's very clear, in this petition, they know that this is a dream, and that and the reality is that you're going to have these big Japanese companies come in with a lot of direct marketing. They're going to do discounting in big department stores, which they do, and they're just going to blow away these little guys. They don't blow away the portrait studios. The portrait studios stay there, which I want to follow up with that. I mean, that's one part of the book is going to be following these portrait studios. But the camera guys and the gear guys, not so much. I mean, they, what they feared, comes to be for the most part. But I think they imagined they'd be independent, entrepreneurs and strike their deals, but they don't. Actually, I don't know if that helped. Yeah. Anybody else? Please. Don't let me off so easy.
Hi, my name is Yoonji Choi, and I work on art history, mostly on crafts, on Japanese pre-modern and modern objects. And I'm very happy to know you and what you're working on. It's very interesting. And in terms of some of the aspects on portrait photography, I was wondering whether it is a tradition for a photographic studios to have a bisoin or like aesthetic or like beauty salons next to it. Is it a tradition only in Japan or Okinawa, or is it something that has been done already in America? And my second question is regarding a more general history of how multicolor photography has been introduced to Okinawa.
Oh gosh, those questions will lead me down a rabbit hole, and I'd be happy to take you there. Your first question about the aesthetic and beauty. Yeah, knowing what I do of like 19th century photography in Europe and how it developed. I mean, a lot of it was these set scenes with backdrops and costumes and such, and so they kind of had all that beauty salon like stuff there in these portrait studios. I think you're picking up on the Sonodas. I mean, Sonoda Minobu. I mean, he had his studio, and then his wife ran the beauty salon. It's kind of a natural pairing there. And there are a couple old studios that still exist, like from back then, the buildings. And I visited a couple of them, And you can see they do have these areas where you can do your makeup and stuff, but how much that, I mean, where that comes from, how long and how widespread it is. I mean, I think it's reasonable to assume that many of these portrait studios did have those types of facilities. And one thing what I thought you were going to maybe ask, well, you kind of did, and I wanted you to ask this because I wanted to mention it. And this is going to come up like in the fourth chapter of the book, I forget, where like during the 50s, these Okinawan photographers are really kind of learning techniques. They're learning, and they're kind of mimicking like the technical kind of things you do, like, oh, let's do good portraits. And they were way into, how they could perfect the lighting and such for portraiture, okay? And then it's actually Yamada in the late 50s when he starts doing his own street photography. I'm calling it street photography. And it kind of dawns on me, said, oh, everyone's obsessed with doing this kind of, traditional, standard, studio photography. And part of it was because they were learning these techniques and such. But then he says, wait a second. Let's take pictures like of Okinawans running around the streets and stuff. And he's well known. He's famous for doing these, wonderful street photography of kids and laborers and, old women in the streets and the markets and such, And he claims to be like the first to do this kind of thing. He's probably the first to be well known, for it. But so I think your question is kind of getting to this point that, there's traditions, there's ways of doing this, you learn it like this. And most of them were doing this kind of thing throughout the 50s. And then he comes on and says, he says this in an essay. He says, after a while I thought we weren't doing photos of Okinawa, of Okinawan people. The last part of the book is going to be about place and people and like how photographic Okinawa gets sort of, created, in this way. And it's created by mainland photographers in another way. And it's created by, American photographers another way. And sometimes they overlap, sometimes they don't. So that's going to be a fun part of the book, I think. But that's, I think you put your finger on this issue of tradition and what you're supposed to be doing and then what you can do. Yeah. Great question. Anybody? Yeah, Susan.
You mentioned early on about the role that the pawn shops play in this kind of economy, and I guess so these just sort of ordinary soldiers who come with a camera from the U.S. Is that?
No. These are guys they want Japanese cameras. Yeah. And this, that's part of the story too. That these are some of the best cameras coming out, and they can get them cheaper. If you're buying a camera that's shipped from Japan to the States, there's import tariffs, and so these guys are like, wow, I can get this. Well, they weren't buying a Nikon SP; those are way too expensive. But they're buying, maybe the next rung, and they can afford it, and so they're buying stuff there. Well, yeah, or in a shop like Yamada's. I mean, he was the local rep, the sole agent for Nikon, and Americans particularly like Nikons. Actually, they call them Nikons. He jokes about it. He says the Americans would come in and they'd ask for Nikons. Oh yeah, Nikon. Yeah. And so he goes on about how the vast majority of his business were American military personnel in his shop, and that's an interesting story too because a younger generation of documentary type photographers who are doing photos of the bases, of the Koza riot, of these type of really political things dealing with the bases, they take Yamada to task for not doing that. Oh, you're doing, these feel-good photos of kids. They're beautiful photos, I have to say. I love his photos, right? But they take him to task. And he says, in an interview, he says, well, it's not that I didn't take those photos, but I didn't print and publish those. He did a couple. But he said, I didn't publish those photos because my clientele were American military personnel. And I just felt that it wouldn't be right if I did that stuff and published it and they were my clients. So he, and these younger guys, they actually get angry at him, for like selling out in that way. And there's so much, there's so many things you accuse one or the other that they're doing this time, and I think it's way too simple to say he's selling out. It's much more complicated than that. He was running a business, and he'd have to get out of the business. He would think if he did that kind of activist photography. Yeah. But the pawn shop thing is really interesting. I have more material on that because it's this informal economy where the only thing, like if a local wanted a fairly new Japanese camera, they couldn't afford the new stuff. They could possibly, get it through the secondary market, through the pawn shops. And Yamada and others talk about that. They would scoop these up, and then they could sell them to a friend or somebody who can afford it, a little more. And there's these really sad stories about American military, and they would literally go to these pawn shops, like in that one photo that I showed you, that they would sell their gear before going out to Vietnam because they thought they wouldn't be coming back. Yeah. So anything else? Yeah.
I'm curious to know why Japanese cameras are so good.
I would say, like, why is everything Japanese so good? Anyway, that's a tough question. I mean, oh gosh, again, you're getting into a technical question that I could totally go on and on about. Where do I start? Yeah, I don't want to say it's because they imitated German cameras, because that sounds too simple. But many of the earlier Japanese cameras, even from the 30s and 40s and 50s, they were, because that was the era where German cameras were the best. And so they rightfully looked at these cameras and said, how are we going to reverse engineer these? How are we going to make less expensive copies of them? And they did that. I wouldn't call it like just pure imitation copying, but they're looking at these good cameras and then doing their versions of them.
What about like access to resources and stuff?
Pardon?
What about like access to resources and stuff?
Well, in mainland Japan, there wasn't they had, well, what kind of resources are you talking about?
So I only know one random tidbit that I'm thinking about, which is that like the rubber that was used for film development was discovered in Taiwan by some white guy. So I'm just thinking like.
No, that's I'd have to look into like those kind of details of what kinds of materials to build these cameras that you would need.
Like where were they sourcing this from? There's this whole casual economy of like snipping film up and like cobbling together, and if it's cheaper than American stuff.
Well, see, a lot of the cheaper than American or in this case like German stuff was the way they would they would use like less metal in the cameras. It's almost like how they built the Zero fighter. They shaved it down to be just it could still be sturdy, but you use like. Okay, my wife has a Rolleiflex. It's a 1958 Rolleiflex. It's a German camera. They're coveted by many people. They're very sturdy. They feel good. They're well known. Whatever. Everyone wants one except me. I think they're like way over-engineered. They have like redundant systems on redundant systems of them, and they're really complicated, to repair and to work on. Now, Yashica, they came out with sort of their version of it, and it's lightweight, it's straightforward. It does about the same thing. The lenses are just about the same. And I have a Yashica. My wife has the Rollei. And so that's just an example of how they would take this really good German camera and they say, oh, we don't need that. We don't need that. We'll kind of shave it down and make it cheaper, but still be really good. I love my Yashica. And the Rollei, when it had to go into repair, I took it to the one shop in the Nashville area that actually works on old cameras, and the woman who worked on it, she says, these things are just such a bear. I had to take a special course to learn how to work on these things because they're so complicated. And then I brought my Yashica in just for a routine tune-up, and she's like, "Oh, this thing is so easy to work on." You know. Yeah, so you led me a little bit down the geeky photo hole. Yeah.
Just a follow-up to that, like how quickly did the Japanese camera companies kind of retool their manufacturing after the war?
Oh, that took a while because, well, you know, a lot of, as you know, you're in the immediate post-war, like any industry that looked like it could support war material or whatever, you know, was limited. With the reverse course, then, you know, the occupation authorities and the U.S. authorities are kind of opening things up. And if I were to track, that's an interesting question, because you know, one could probably get at that by sort of tracking these camera designs. It's probably an easier way to do it. But, you know, this is why I think, you know, you see a lot of changes after the end of U.S. occupation in '52. You're leading me astray again, but but in my sort of casual examination of, because I collect a lot of these cameras from the '50s, and I could see these how they're kind of just like copies of these things, and then I noticed these changes, and a lot of them are really technical things with viewfinders and such that I don't want to bore you with. But it's then when I actually thought about it. I'm like, oh, well, gosh, they changed this, the total design of this. How did they have to, like, you know, change the tooling for it, the manufacture it? I don't know those on that sort of granular level of what they're doing. But I think, you know, by the mid-'50s, it's really like mid-late '50s when things start really kicking in gear, and you see some Japanese manufacturers are doing really sort of innovative things, and they're taking on these German cameras. And that's why there's sort of a tipping point in the early '60s. And then when the Nikon F comes out and blows everybody away, you know, and it comes out in the early '60s, and then they have different models of it, et cetera. So, you know, one could maybe point to then, you know, all the high growth economy in the mainland in the '60s and how everything's kicking up then, you know, and then they're exporting all these things around the world, and this was the go-to camera for Vietnam photojournalists. You know, many of them, you know, talk about how great that camera was. You know, so.
I'm just curious, like, what's that inflection point where you could expect the servicemen to come over and covet
Yeah,
photojournalists are maybe ahead of the curve, but when does it,
you know, this is just an educated guess, maybe not even that educated. You know, I would say, you know, by the late '60s, mid-late '60s, you know, because then you start by the '70s, it's done. I think, you know, yeah, I think, you know, late '60s. I'm glad you guys are asking me questions that allow me to talk about these geeky technical things. Yeah, one more question.
So this is going to take us into a less technical direction because I can't follow you on a lot of the technical I'm very interested in investing in this issue that you sort of teased at the end about how photography plays out slightly differently from other industries. And part of the reason I'm interested in that is the affective attachment to photography. But to sort of narrow that a little bit more, I'm very interested in the idea that the people that are doing these photography or photo studios are doing IDs, right, presumably local IDs, passports for sort of international verification of identity and travel, but also potentially family photos, right, these very intimate settings. So I'm interested in sort of how they function within the community. So when someone like Yamada, again, I don't know if he's actually involved in sort of the actual photography end, but is sort of giving them impassioned letters about their livelihoods. Is there something about also the community, right, their integration, their status within the community? What was the sort of affective connection that people in the community have with these photography studios and their impact and their association with that? If that comes together.
Yeah, you know, first of all, Yamada never had a portrait studio. Yeah, he sold cameras and he did a little bit of the DPE stuff. This is kind of what I think that when studio owners who I interviewed was sort of getting at. He pulled out like all of these family albums of things. It was like the history of the family, his family, but then of some of his clients, you know. and that's when he started talking about how, oh, we invented this day for doing this kind of photo. And of course, there's, you know, weddings and you know, birthdays and such. And school photos was something that was a huge, huge thing, a large part of their business. And so, you know, I suppose, you know, at least what I've seen and what I heard, you know, that, I mean, I don't know, I guess, you know, to what extent is it sort of different in Okinawa, that aspect of it, you know, from the mainland. You know, it's my feeling that, you know, Okinawa is a small place, and there were a lot of these portrait studios. It was kind of like, you know, it was a thing to do. You know, the family would go for these special occasions, or for like souvenir photos.
And again, like I know, you know, 20 temples in a tiny little.
Yeah. Well, and my feeling is that, you know, again, just from what I've sort of casually seen, and just the sheer number of these, the density of these, you know, that it was a thing, you know, more so than, you know, in mainland Japan. You know, maybe, you know, like in Tokyo, in a big city, there's this kind of like, you know, urban anomie, and you don't do, you know, but, you know, in Okinawa, there's just more community to begin with, I would say. And this was one way to kind of mark that, you know, kind of realize that. Again, you know, I'm just kind of extrapolating from, you know, a few conversations that I had. But I follow some of these guys on Twitter, like the fourth generation of the Azuma studio. I didn't meet him. He was too shy to meet with me. You know, I contacted him, and, you know, and he was just afraid to meet some foreign guy, I think, you know, and we exchanged, you know, some emails, and I know exactly where his studio is, and he's the fourth generation from pre-war, you know, and I go, I really want to meet this guy. But you know, I follow him on Twitter, and you know, he posts something, and I kind of like, I might say something. But you know, there's a few of these persons who are in this family line that extend back from pre-war to the present. There's a few of them that I know, and you know, they're the ones I kind of want. I mean, what's the family lore? You know? Yeah. Show me more of those family albums, and yeah, I have to do more of that. But then that all shut down with COVID, you know, and I can't. You know, when are we gonna get back to Japan? I'm so frustrated right now, actually, about that. So anyway, thank you all for your attention and indulging me with the technical stuff. And
it was so much fun to go down these rabbit holes. So
yeah, I know. We just, I try to keep that out. Because I just
it's obvious you can't help yourself. So let's